My name is Gail. I'm one of the co-owners of Wonderland Books, so thank you for coming out tonight for one of our author events. I don't know if this is your first time in the store, if you've been here before, but welcome. We're happy to have you. Tonight, I'm very excited because we have a fiction event. We've had so many non-fiction events. And I was like, so we're super happy to have Kristin Koval here tonight. She is the author of Penitence, which is a new debut novel, which is a little bit of a mystery, family drama, courtroom, social justice, has lots of elements to it. Chris, like me, is a former lawyer and a dog lover, so we're thrilled to have her in the most dog-friendly bookstore on the planet.
Love that.
And I'm just happy to have her here tonight. And she's going to do a short reading from the book, and then I have some questions, and then we'll open it to you guys for questions.
All right. I'm so happy to have all of you guys here, and especially happy to see my roommate from all the way in 1984 and my aunt from all the way when I was born, and her whole family, which is wonderful. And so thank you for coming, everybody else. I am just going to read from the prologue, which are the opening pages. There are no spoilers in here, so if you haven't read the book yet, this isn't gonna ruin any surprises for you. Prologue. Nora Sheehan sits in a jail cell in Lodgepole, Colorado, surrounded by 3 cinder block walls and the kind of steel bars she's only seen on television, gray and cold. She's 13, the woman she might become still a shadow, even though she's ready to discard her childhood. A longing for her stuffed penguin, a gift on her 4th birthday from her older brother Nico, grips her with an intensity she doesn't understand, and she twists her thin arms around her shoulders, a featherless bird warming herself with naked wings. She doesn't look like the sort of girl that just shot her brother. The two cops in the adjoining room, arguing about what to do next, don't stop to think about whether or not Nora is cold. Lodgepole, a 3-hour drive from the nearest small city, is not equipped to handle a murder or a murderer, and not equipped for a 13-year-old criminal of any kind. The older cop is thinking of his 14-year-old daughter, sleeping at home under a polka-dotted comforter, and her upcoming quinceañera, when she thinks she'll become a woman. The younger cop is thinking of how quickly the life drained out of the 3 holes in the dead boy. How quickly a human body pales without its blood. Both wring their hands, at times squeezing so hard their fingertips blanch. This kind of thing doesn't happen in their town. It only happens on the news. It can't be real. Angie Sheehan is at home in the purple house on Pine Street with chipped paint, staring at the crime scene tape covering the door to her son's room. The same tape covers the door to her daughter's room. Nico's bed lies empty, and she wishes she could sink into the faint imprint his body made on the mattress, smell the sweetly masculine body spray he convinced her to buy to mask his burgeoning teenage odor. Angie shivers, not from shock or terror, but because when her husband David left to find a lawyer, he left the front door cracked, and a cold draft winds through the house. I should go close that door, she thinks. We can't afford a higher heating bill, not now. She's alone with the noises of an empty home, noises that will rattle around the rest of her life. She closes her eyes against the crime scene tape, the cold, and the leaden dawn leaking through the window at the end of the hallway. Across town, David pounds on Martine Dumont's door. He's here because Martine didn't answer her phone. Why would she at 5:25 a.m.? And he's already pressed the doorbell once, twice, 3 times. He stood behind her yesterday in Bee's Market when he bought ginger molasses cookies, Nico's favorite, so he knows she's in town. He's always felt a slight distaste for Martine because she handles the ugly divorces and represents criminals like the girl 2 counties over who left her newborn baby in the trash behind the high school. And because she's Julian's mother. When he watched her answer questions about that girl's trial in a press conference, cool and collected, his distaste morphed into a revulsion that brought bile to his throat. How could a mother throw away her child, and how could Martine defend that mother? But now he needs her. he needs cool and collected. He pounds harder. Martine, still blissfully asleep, not yet a part of the unfolding tragedy, is on the left side of the bed, even though her husband Cyrus has been gone for more than a year. She fell asleep to the hoots of a great horned owl echoing through the house's metal chimney. Hoo-hoo-hoos, cascading into each other in a gentle reverberation she felt rather than heard. A synesthesia pattering up and down her limbs. When the pounding finally wakes her, she jolts. Someone has died. That's the only reason for a knock on the door at this hour. Julian, she thinks wildly, but only momentarily. He wouldn't have named her as an emergency contact, not after all this time, and not when he lives in New York. Someone warning of a fire, maybe, but it's late in the season. Snow already blankets town, a dreary layer of heavy white slop that blew in from the northwest 2 nights ago and caught the snowplows by surprise. It cheered early season skiers, but depressed everyone else. The pounding is probably just a bear knocking over a trash can, searching for food to fatten up before hibernation. She puts on a pair of sweatpants, hopping to pull up the left leg, and stubs her toe on the nightstand. When she yells, "Shit," and leans on the edge of the bed to rub away the pain, her then living husband, her younger self, and the little boy versions of Julian and Gregory stare at her in a two-dimensional reproach from a silver picture frame on the nightstand. Julian, who can't remember the last time he spoke to his mother, is 2 time zones away and already at work. He's a criminal defense attorney working in Manhattan, unaware the consequences of his long ago actions have blossomed, an efflorescence he never anticipated. Martine will be on the news by tonight, her tight-lipped quote about her newest client repeated again and again in sound bites parsed by journalists to attract a Schadenfreude-obsessed world. When he sees the headline sitting in the back of an Uber on his way home at midnight, he'll stop scrolling to skim the article, partly because the murder took place in Colorado, and partly because it's similar to cases he sometimes takes pro bono. When he sees Martine's name, he'll slow down and read more carefully. And when he sees the name of his hometown and the killer's mother's name, Angie Sheehan, he'll turn his phone over and look out the Uber window, not seeing or hearing the honking cars crowding a blocked intersection. And Nico is in the morgue.
Powerful stuff. So I read something that you wrote about that you used to think that forgiveness was something that was given from the wronged to the person who wronged them, but that you decided that in fact it is a gift to the person who has been wronged, the ability to forgive.
Yes.
Which is an incredibly powerful theme. And in this novel, there's many people who have wronged and many people who have been wronged. I wanted to know, how did you first get interested in this idea of this notion of guilt and forgiveness?
That's a really good question. So I personally have had really impactful experiences with forgiveness, both being forgiven and forgiving other people. But before I had those experiences, I think I sort of spent a fair amount of my life feeling angry pretty frequently and feeling wronged. And every time I felt angry and wronged, I couldn't somehow get past it because I didn't have enough forgiveness in my life. But I think all that time, I often couldn't forgive other people because I thought I was giving them a gift. In other words, I thought, oh, here's this person who did something wrong and I'm giving them a gift of forgiveness. And then one day I had a couple of people in my life who had actually wronged somebody else in my life that I really love. And I had tried to forgive them for a really long time. And I was just driving and all of a sudden it hit me. I didn't need to be angry anymore at them. I could forgive them. And this wave of sort of peace and relief washed over me. And that was what enabled me to figure out that when you forgive another person, it's the universe or God or whatever belief system you have, that's that entity giving you a gift. And that feeling kind of changed my life, because it made me a more empathetic person and a more compassionate person. And once I started letting go of anger for things that had happened to me, it made me a much happier person. And that feeling of peace and relief was something I wanted to communicate in the book. But it's really hard to write about forgiveness without sounding preachy. And so I had this very long-term desire to write about that feeling of forgiveness as receiving a gift, and eventually figured out a way to do it in this novel.
So without giving away any spoilers, because there's a lot of suspense in the book, there are a lot of complicated relationships where people have, sort of their lives have overlapped in a lot of ways, and that there's forgiveness and wronging going in a lot of directions. And I'm interested in your writing process, and I want to know, did you have all of those plotted out before you started the book, or did any of those emerge organically as you got into the story?
Most of them I had plotted out in advance. The way that I write is a little different from some people. I know that a lot of writers like to do character sketches, and they'll write 3 or 4 pages just on one character. But for me, I can't do that. I can't think about a character in a vacuum all by themselves, because I think that we are defined by our relationships. And so the way I think about my characters, I draw a big picture, and there are a lot of different arrows going from each character to another character. And I'm thinking about who all these people are in relation to each other. And so all of those complicated entanglements, those were things I had thought about in advance. There were a couple that developed as I wrote, but for the most part, because of the way I like to think about human beings and my characters as human beings, I had figured them out in advance.
So this is kind of a related question. There's a crime at the center of the book. You mentioned it early, and this is not a spoiler, that Nora kills Nico.
Right.
That's not you know that from the book jacket, I think.
And the first page.
And the first page. But most of this book is actually really about things that happened long before that. There's lots and lots of looking back on relationships and sort of how they got to that point. What was your thinking behind kind of shifting the reader's attention away from the crime to all this other stuff?
So I mentioned before that I had really wanted to find a way to write about that feeling of forgiveness and the feeling of when you forgive another person, it's a gift, but also thinking, gosh, I don't want to sound like I'm preaching at my readers, and I also don't want to sound holier than thou. And I had seen a lot of news accounts, more than you would ever think, about juvenile fratricide. And it's much more common than you would think. But when I saw those news accounts, I wasn't actually all that interested in the salacious details of the crime. I was far more interested in the parents and what happens to the poor parents afterwards. If they've lost one child that's been killed and they're about to lose a second child who's going to go to prison for doing the killing, what must that be like for him? And I realized that exploring the aftermath of the crime from a personal point of view rather than from a criminal justice point of view would give me the chance to explore forgiveness and think about how complicated it is, and think about how messy it is, and the fact that it doesn't always come easily, but when it comes, it's a great thing. And so not focusing on the crime gave me the freedom to focus on those emotional issues instead.
So another thing you've written about is that in this age of social media, where things can be recorded and amplified so quickly, it's very difficult to distance yourself from actions you might have done. Do you think, though, that we all have such short attention spans? Does that mitigate that like people do move on from news cycles? Is there kind of like a merciful forgetting that happens? Or do you think once these things are recorded that you're kind of branded for life as the person who did X?
That's another great question, and one problem with social media is that I feel like it can make us a lot more judgmental, simply because when a recording is placed, whether it's on Instagram or just even on the news, and it's played on, NBC nightly news, that's all people see. They don't see the whole person. They don't necessarily know that this person isn't defined by that one really bad thing that they did in their life. So I do think that social media amplifies the bad thing that a human being has done. On the other hand, yes, because our attention spans are so short, we have a little bit of a short memory. But in general, I feel like our society is so judgmental right now that we've kind of walked back from the Constitution that says innocent until proven guilty. And right now, I think that a lot of the time, the attitude of the public is that once a person has been accused, they are indeed guilty. And that's not fair or right or just. And unfortunately, I think that judgment kind of stays with people. Remember the bombing in Atlanta in the 1992 Olympics, that poor guy, Richard Jewell, he didn't do it, but his whole life was ruined by that.
Right. And look, we all still know his name.
Right? Yes,
yeah, it just came right out, when you said that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I love books where a story is told through multiple perspectives and you've got shifting narration. And how did you choose actually let me rephrase that. Was your choice of who narrated a particular section of the plot, a particular, development that moved the story forward, was your choice of the narrator driven by a desire to guide the reader toward a certain judgment or a certain sort of perspective on guilt, or was that not part of that choice?
No, it was definitely, I did think carefully usually about who was telling which part of the story. It was very important to me that two of the narrators were the criminal justice or the criminal defense attorneys, because I really wanted the reader to start to realize how important it is to have criminal defense attorneys to a functioning legal system that enables people to have fair trials. So there were certain aspects of Nora's story that I wanted to really be filtered through those attorneys. On the other hand, different characters are able to forgive each other, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say that Martine and Julian eventually, when they reunite, I wanted that told through a mother's point of view, because that human element was really important to me. And then, of course, Nora's pieces, when she's in the juvenile detention center, and it's a pretty brutal place for a 13-year-old to be, I thought it was important to have a lot of the biases in those systems kind of be out there in the open for the reader to see. And then Angie, she's a mom, and so I thought that there were things that really needed to be portrayed about her grief, because you can't go through what Angie goes through without terrible grief.
Losing 2 kids at one time.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm a former lawyer like you, and I know that I could, in a million years, never write anything about criminal procedure. I'd be just as ill-equipped as somebody who never went to law school. Did you study criminal law? Did you practice criminal law?
I did not practice criminal law. In fact, I was the very geekiest kind of a lawyer. I did trust and estates law. So I was writing wills and trusts and doing people's, estate taxes and income taxes. And so I think I had been in the courtroom twice for a couple of probate cases, and that was it. So I needed to do a lot of research. As a lawyer, it was pretty easy for me to know where to do the research, and I can also read a statute and actually understand what it says. I can kind of break through the legalese.
Right.
But eventually I had to spend a lot of time with two criminal defense attorneys, because a lot of what the law says should happen isn't actually what does happen. And I wanted it to be very, very realistic. So one example, and this is not a spoiler, because you know this at the end of the first chapter, David, Nora's father, thinks that he's going to write a calendar of everything that's going to happen in Nora's criminal case. And I assumed that that would all be guided by the juvenile justice system and all the deadlines in there, which basically say that after 6 months, Nora's case should be resolved. And I counted out all the days, because X was supposed to happen by 9 days, and then Y was supposed to happen at 16 days. And, you know, so I had this whole schedule. And then partway through writing the book, once I started talking to these criminal defense attorneys, they said there is no way in the state of Colorado that a prosecutor would ever allow a 13-year-old accused of murder to proceed under the juvenile justice system, that they would they would definitely try them as an adult. So even though Nora is 13, the prosecutors in the state of Colorado by law have the option to try her as an adult, and these attorneys said that every prosecutor would proceed with that option. So I needed them to tell me, as part of their research, that even though I had technically done my research correctly, that wasn't practically speaking what would happen. And then we started over, and they gave me what would happen in the adult criminal justice system to a juvenile.
Got it. Okay, I want to avoid any spoilers.
Yes.
But I will say there is a little bit of ambiguity about the ending, as far as guilt and motive. I mean, you know, we know what happened, but as far as delving in, and you leave it a little vague and a little unclear. And I think that there's some things that happen at the end that would actually potentially spread some guilt and blame even broader than we expected. Which we can talk about that afterwards, because I have a very specific thing I'm talking about. But I just wanted to know, how did you approach the ending of the book, knowing that readers generally like to have things tied up in some way? So what was your thinking about how you wanted to wrap up the story?
I have to think about how I answer this so I don't spoil anything. I knew the point at which I wanted people to get to emotionally, and that was how I wanted to wrap up the story, were with the emotions. I actually did not want to give readers an answer as to motive, because I think that readers are smart, and that when readers read a book, even though they think they want an answer, if they don't have an answer, it gives them something to think about and talk about, and the book will kind of linger in their minds a little bit. I wanted the book to kind of meet the intelligence of the reader, and I just know that people are so smart in general when they're thinking about those human emotions that they might want to do some thinking. The other thing is that I have a pretty strong belief that when bad things happen in the world, there's not necessarily a good answer. That there's not often a satisfying answer when a bad thing happens. And an example I like to give people is that, let's say there's a car accident. You're in a car accident coming home from work, and you're coming home from work late because a customer came in at the very end of the day, and you really wanted to help this person. So you leave late, you're rushing home. Your husband calls and says, "We need a quart of milk for breakfast tomorrow. I forgot to go get it." Well, you decide to turn left to go to the 7-Eleven instead of right to go into the supermarket. And then you get T-boned in the intersection, and you get T-boned by a person who's driving drunk, and they're driving drunk either because they're an alcoholic, or because they went to an office party after work, or because they got into a fight with their significant other, but they're drunk. And so all those things combine to result in a car accident. Not really a single one of them is the absolute reason for it.
Right.
And so I think that can apply in most situations, that there's a constellation of things that apply to result in where you end up.
Makes a lot of sense.
And I get a little bit of both when I talk to readers. I get some readers who really want the answer, the why. They really want to know why, what was the motive. And then I get others who say, thank you so much for not wrapping up the ending in a neat bow. I really appreciate that. So I've gotten the, you know, both comments from people. I still have the belief that I have, which is that bad things happen for a constellation of reasons. So for me, I made the right choice.
Talk about Colorado, New York juxtaposition. Everything takes place in Colorado, with the exception of some things in the past, some important things in the past that happened in New York City. How did you choose New York, and like talk about the cities as kind of characters in the book?
Yeah, so
or the state and the city.
Yeah,
so
Colorado, I live in Colorado, and I spend a lot of time outside. So I have a lot of people say to me, it's almost like the state is a character in the book. And that's great. That's a huge compliment. I'm very happy with that, because I do spend a lot of time in the book describing the outdoors and the beauty of the outdoors. And I also feel like the outdoors helps reflect a lot of the emotion that's happening. I use it as a way to reflect the emotion of what's happening in the novel. And so it was natural for me to set it in Colorado. And I also wanted it to be a small town book. And so I chose a small town in Colorado. However, I also really wanted to address a lot of criminal justice, social justice issues in the novel. And a lot of the we're in a bad place right now with how we treat juveniles in the criminal justice system. And a lot of those really harsh rules actually emanated from some terrible things that happened in New York City in the 80s and the 90s. And so it was a good city for me to have Julian, the sort of more sophisticated criminal defense attorney. It was good for me to have him be based there. And also I've lived in New York.
Yeah, let her explore. It's fine. No, it's fine.
Sure.
Yeah.
So nothing breakable.
So it was a good place for me to have him be from, because it was easier for me to write about.
And it sets up Angie's choice of two very different lifestyles.
It does. And while I've been very careful to never ever have an actual human being represented in the novel, you know, there's no person that represents a human being in my life, and I'm not in any of these characters. The one place I might be is that I sometimes feel a dichotomy between New York and Colorado, because I've lived in both places for long periods of time, and my sons are now both in New York, and so it's sort of a refrain in my head constantly about these two very different places in my life.
Talk about the process of being a first-time author of a book that, I mean, I first learned about your book because it was chosen as a Book of the Month selection, which is huge.
Thank you.
And then, of course, as a bookstore owner, I start to see the press and everything came out. So what has that been like?
It has been overwhelming and exciting all at the same time. I liked being a lawyer, but I didn't love being a lawyer. And when I stopped lawyering on a regular basis to go do something I really wanted to do, I knew I was taking a sort of leap of faith. And I had a lot of people look at me like I was a little bit crazy, including my parents. And her sister. So it's scary to leave a paying job never knowing whether or not your book will be published. And when it actually got published, that was great. And then when it was published to all the acclaim, you know, all the different accolades that I got, which I was thrilled by but didn't really ever expect, it was a huge thrill. I feel a little bit like I won the lotto. I've loved the process of it. It's been really fun, and I can't wait to start writing again.
Well, that was going to be my last question: is are you writing another book, and what do you think would it be? Similar themes or something very different?
So different theme. I'm hoping to write a little bit about identity. Sort of, are we who we think we are, or are we who other people think we are? And it will probably be a little bit of literary suspense again. I like writing a book that's sort of driven by a little bit of plot and a little bit of character, but not just one or the other. I like both of them to be in there.
We'd like to open it now to questions from the audience.
So I can't help but think a little bit about Lionel Shriver's book we have to talk about.
Yeah.
Which a difference with that is that the I haven't read your book, so I shouldn't say what the difference is, but I also like the way that book that's about killing one's family members is ambiguous at the end. Like, I remember the mother saying to her son, like, so why did you do it? And he said, I have no idea. So I like sort of hearing that you also didn't believe in kind of tying it up necessarily, like, but I don't know, did you think about that book at all when you were writing?
I've actually never read it.
Okay.
I guess I should go read it now.
It will haunt you.
Yeah, is that the one where he's really pretty mentally unstable and he does some really evil things?
He's
I did read.
He's I mean, I would call him a psychopath. Like that's he's diagnosable.
School killer. School shooting.
Yeah.
And is that the bow and arrow one? You're right.
You read it.
I did read it. I did
Okay.
read it. Yeah, I was horrified by that book.
But it sort of ends with a sort of almost gentle, like, ambiguity. I mean, that's the only thing that's gentle about that book. But
Yeah. That didn't feel as ambiguous to me because I felt an overwhelming sense of this kid's kind of evilness
psychosis, yeah.
and him being a psychopath. And I don't know that I thought that about Nora. I mean, she has a mental illness, but she's not Kevin. So so that's a really interesting way to think about that book as it being ambiguous.
And maybe that's just because it's the mother
Who's doing it.
it's a mother-son. They develop a different relationship once he's in prison.
Yeah.
Right. And that's how she lives her life, is visiting him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
I like ambiguity though. I mean,
Yeah.
I love movies that end on ambiguity. Inception, where you never really know, is he dreaming or not dreaming? I like that kind of an ending, so it's also something I prefer. So
Yeah.
that was me ending the book out the way I wanted to end.
So I read the book, really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So, you did a great job with the characters. They're, very realistic to me, and I love the settings, and, particularly the Colorado settings and the descriptions of, Angie and Julian were young and their favorite spot in the woods, and that was really beautiful. My question, I'm trying to frame my question without spoiling it. There's one main character, not Nora, who sort of, like a lot of your characters sort of come clean or are found out with things that have happened in the past that influence the story. But there's one main character who doesn't really come clean about something that happened in the past. And I was just wondering if that was intentional, and I don't know if you can intuit who I'm speaking about.
Well, all the characters are flawed, and it was intentional. Yeah,
Okay.
I think that I first of all think that we all make big mistakes in our life, as I mentioned before, and so in order for that to be obvious in the book, I needed to make the characters all really flawed. And the thing is that although we all like mistakes, or we all make mistakes, none of us like to talk about those mistakes. When I do these events and I say, oh, we all make mistakes, everybody in the room nods. Nobody ever raises their hand and says, let me tell you about my mistake. I mean, that's not something we like to do. And I have made mistakes. I'll say that. And I'm trying to, not do, make mistakes as I get older and learn and do better and be a better person. But I'll admit to making those mistakes for sure. But I think that some people are willing to do that and admit to their mistakes, and some people it's harder for them to get to that point. They're afraid of judgment, or they're afraid of hurting people, or they're afraid of what it means to admit to a mistake.
But I feel like a lot of getting to forgiveness is sometimes you have to, own up to something.
I
or
think
let it-
that's right,
And I
yeah.
feel like that character really needed forgiveness, but.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think that part of
But-
getting to forgiveness is being willing to admit to having made a mistake.
Yeah.
But that's hard, right?
Yes.
I mean, think about when you raise children, how hard it is to get people to say, I am sorry, and mean it. But actually also think about even adults in, romantic relationships, how hard it is for people when they have disagreements to say, I'm sorry, and mean it.
No, I thought, it's very realistic, those relationships and everything, so anyway.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Thank
So
you.
it's good.
Why did you name the book Persistent?
Oh, that's a really good question, James. So I gave it that name because penitence means to be sorry. It's sort of or to feel sorry. When you're feeling penitence, it's when you're feeling sorry for what you've done. And so the complicated answer to that question is that penitence has a Latin root to it, penitere, which spawns a whole bunch of etymological cousins to the word. So there's repent, which is to be sorry, to act sorry and to make up for what you've done. Penitentiary, which is where we send people to punish them and so that they will be sorry. Penance is the actual punishment, and that has both a religious meaning in the Catholic Church and a secular meaning. And a penitent also has a religious meaning and a secular meaning. But in my mind, all those things come back to the core concept of the fact that we all make mistakes. And if we can all recognize that we all make mistakes and that we're all sorry for it, eventually that can help us feel empathy for another person. And if you can feel empathy for another person, you might be more inclined to grant them mercy. And if you grant them mercy, you might eventually land on forgiveness. So I feel like all those concepts are tied together. That's a good question, James.
Did you have a question?
So I read the book and I loved it, and I'm so proud to know you, Chris. I'm almost weepy thinking about it. But of course, Nico is the victim, right? But Nora she underwent a huge trauma in what she did, and her behavior afterwards was so extreme, and I wonder whether writing her behavior was that sort of to drive the plot, or was it based on sort of like psychological trauma or something else entirely?
It was a little bit of both. The reality is that I did not want to spend the book in the courtroom because that would not have allowed me to go down the road I wanted to go down, which was the emotional toll this took on the family and how do you get to forgiveness. And so if she had been speaking, giving up information to the cops, that would have complicated her legal situation. And so in some ways it was good for her to not speak, but that was also when I did all of the research, that's a pretty common response to trauma. So I read the entire DSM manual to figure out, and the Nelson's textbook of pediatrics, all the aspects in there that talk to the mental health of young children, and so that would be a common reaction. So 2 parts.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so I also read the book, I really liked it.
Thank you.
And I'm also trying to think of how to phrase this without like spoiling anything, but there are things that you learn at the beginning of the book from Martine's point of view, kind of about Nora's relationship with her parents, specifically like when she sees they were using things like that. Just kind of like inferences I made, I guess, about Nora's relationship with her father versus her relationship with her mother.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a reason why you chose Martine's point of view to kind of be the first introduction we get into like, I guess, yeah, just how Nora's relationship differs between these two people.
Nobody's ever asked me that question before, so that's a great question. I really wanted to start out with Martine because in my mind she was the person she was kind of the glue between all of the different characters. And it ended up working out really well to have her observing the different relationships between the parents rather than having that filtered through Angie, the mother, because Angie would have been biased in the way she communicated that. And Julian wasn't there to watch that. So some of it was a sort of a less biased way to prevent that viewpoint. That's a really great question. Thank you for asking that.
I always like to ask authors, can you cast the movie of this book?
I can cast Martine. I would want that to be Frances McDormand.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Because I love her. I think she would do a great job. I think Adam Driver would make a good Julian. I have no idea who would be Angie or Nora.
Does anyone have
Anybody
an
have
idea?
any good ideas?
Who did you picture in your mind when you were reading Angie?
Oh, wow. Taylor Swift.
Oh,
That's a good idea. I like that.
She can do anything.
She can do anything. She's the $1 billion girl.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to imagine writing a book and getting to the finish line. You know, like at what point were you comfortable handing it over and saying, I'm not gonna redo anything in here anymore?
I got to a point where I hated the book because I had read it so many times. I'm as a lawyer, I'm a proofreader. I cannot hand something in. I even look at the emails that I send, 5 or 6 times just to make sure that there aren't going to be mistakes in it. And so I read this book hundreds of times, and I did get to a point where I started thinking I don't like this book anymore, or when I started moving a comma from here to there and back again all over the course of like 39 minutes for that single comma, I was like, I think I'm done. I don't think that I can't do anything else. Or sometimes I would think to myself, oh my gosh, I forgot to put this sentence in here, and I would be reading it and trying to edit the book, and I would put that sentence in, and then 16 minutes later I would realize I already had that sentence in there, 6 pages before or 6 after, and I just had gone through the book too many times. And there came a point when I needed to rely on other people and not myself.
So then the next question is, how did you work with your editor? Because normally the point at which you hate the book is the point where you send it to an editor and then it starts over.
Well, my editor, I sent it to my editor, and she took probably 2 months to get back to me with all of my comments. And so at least by then I had some separation from it. So the process the timeline sort of restarted itself. And then the same thing would happen. We went through 2 rounds of edits. So usually there was a bit of time in between me moving commas around. But yeah, it's a good question. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is to look at a book and say, I know how to make this better. Because at a certain point, I didn't know how to make it better.
I'm just curious, because when I was writing, I really enjoyed working as the editor. But how did she influence the book structurally?
How did what?
How did she influence the book structurally, or maybe in terms of your assumptions or questioning your assumptions? How did she impact you? Or the narrative?
She helped me see where there were holes. One of the biggest holes was I didn't have enough Nico in the book. And I was thinking all along, well, we don't need Nico, he's dead. But we really did need Nico, and she was so right on that, and all of the things that I eventually figured out as ways to fix it and put Nico in the book made the book so much better. So her help was pointing out all of the holes in the book.
Is there a world in which you see yourself kind of continuing? Because I know you said your next book you kind of want to focus on like sense of self and I feel like Nora's story, I guess towards the end of her when she gets out of prison, that's not a spoiler, that's good. When she gets out of prison, like, and kind of has to really reconcile, especially because you touched on the criminal justice system lacking, like, rehabilitation necessities for people. Like, is there a world in which you see yourself writing more about Nora afterwards? Kind of
Ooh,
following
that's
that
an
same
interesting
system?
thought. I've had a lot of people say I should write more about Martine. I think people really like to see an older woman with such a large role in a novel because it's an unusual age to have as a protagonist. I hadn't really thought about Nora, but that's a great idea, especially since the book takes place and finishes in 2017. Thank you. I'm gonna go forward with that.
Any other questions?
I guess just a comment about a woman. So I read a book a while ago. It's called A Little Liar, and the protagonist was a criminal defense attorney who's in, I guess, late 40s, maybe in his 50s, but sounds similar to his.
Yeah. I haven't read that one, but
It's a small one.
yeah, I'll look for it. I'm getting all sorts of great reading ideas from you guys.
I
Thank
have
you.
one for you too.
Oh, good.